And somebody coming up briefly, Earth, Wind, and Fire. And I've always liked the old funk sound, but never really settled in and listened to a lot of it in depth. I'd say this would be a really good stop for anybody who wants to get a little deeper into the genre. I have definitely 100% heard Hard Times before somewhere. That was a really good song. That was probably my favorite of the songs on here.
I think that's the first one I heard too. Definitely my favorite. I don't know if it's because it's the first one I've heard or what, but I definitely go back to that song more than anything else on the album.
That's the one where you really feel it most in his voice too. The one that seems like it's cutting deepest with a performance.
He has an incredible voice. And I think he had, no pun intended, a pretty hard life. Basically, like, the minute he got, like, a taste of success, he got really heavy into drinking and heroin, and it killed him.
Yeah, because he already had a glandular problem that had him, like, 400 pounds by the time he died. Between that and drug dependency, unfortunately, he was never going to have long for this world. But if you're going to leave one album to your name, he left a strong one.
And I'm not even entirely sure that this was initially intended as an album. I think it may have been just a collection of tracks. It really didn't sell at all. It was produced by Curtis Mayfield, though.
I saw that. That was cool.
Yeah. And I think it's gained in reputation because it is, as you can see on the Wikipedia page, just as an example, it's been sampled a lot. So it's just one of those albums that was reclaimed by hip-hop, especially back in the 90s when production was basically like, let's have some woke bars over a soul sample. Definitely, if you're a fan of just the history of hip-hop and you want to look at the very early origins of it, I would say check this out. If you are a rock fan and you've been dancing around the issue of getting into funk, I think this is a nice transition piece as well. It does rock. It's not full-on R&B. It kind of has a very unique vibe to it. What do you want to talk about next?
I guess to keep a flow going, let's do Earth, Wind, and Fire with their album Raise. It was their 11th album. Made sure I had the numbers right here. Put out in 1981. It is really hard to nail down a specific Earth, Wind, and Fire album to pick because they're like the ultimate feel-good band. Any album you throw on that I've heard, you're going to have a great time with and just feel good about life. This one starts and ends with two of my favorite songs they've ever done. I think that's what made me decide this was the one, those being Let's Groove and The Changing Times. Unlike Baby Huey, there is definitely a pretty strong disco influence flowing through a lot of this album. Going back to middle school through my mom, my dad would have nothing to do with it, but I did like the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack a lot. It kind of straddles the line of nostalgia for me, where, I used to listen to stuff like that, but then there's also plenty of elements that I came to like later, the more direct soul and things like that. A special credit on this one has to go to Roland Bautista, a guitarist who rejoined the band here after performing, I think, in their third album. There are some blazing guitar solos on this thing, which I never expected, just going off Earth, Wind, and Fire's hits. Musically, really impressive album, just feels great the whole time. Some great bangers, some good slow ballads. It's really just the whole package.
That's kind of like disco's best kept secret of the genre. It's an extremely technically proficient subgenre of music. And I think its image has slowly been rehabilitated over time. The whole yacht rock and West Coast scene and just appreciating session work has aided in that. I forget who said it, some cultural critic or whatever, but they basically said that the reason people hated disco when it was out is it was too black and too gay. I definitely think there was some truth to that. I also think, and it's not something exclusive to disco, but it came about at a time when the young upstart rock critics who came of age in the 60s were angry at any form of popular music, and I think they unfairly took out their frustrations in the changing times on the disco artists. And I think Earth, Wind, and Fire is a really good jumping off point if you're trying to redeem disco in your own mind, or if you want to see, is there anything here for me? I found out about them, I think I've told you this before, it's a name that you know, and I think I knew Let's Groove from the Scarface soundtrack, not the movie, the game, which some people out there might remember. It was a GTA clone.
Oh yeah, the one that ignored all the morals that the movie tried to make.
But was really fun. So other than that, I was on vacation in Ocean City and I was listening to Alex Cooper's radio show, and he played The Quiet Room from the Inside, which we'll definitely talk about on a future episode. And he mentioned that all the background vocals were by Maurice White from Earth, Wind, and Fire. And I was a huge Coop head at the time, so I was like, oh, damn, that's really cool. In fact, if Alice is to be believed, I think it's the only song outside of Earth, Wind, and Fire he ever did backup.
There might be a Tube song in the 80s I could name, but I'd have to double check on that.
But either way, it's definitely a rarity to hear him outside of this project, I think. But that's how I got into them. And then they're one of those bands that if you go to the right Goodwill, you can probably pick up 3 or 4 of their albums for 40 cents. So I had quite a number of their records as a kid. Unfortunately, I don't think I really have many of them now. Not that they were in great condition to begin with. But yeah, Earth, Wind & Fire is a cool band. I don't really know what else to say other than that. You got anything?
That's kind of the word for them, I guess. Nothing else, they're just cool.
Let's talk about like the opposite of cool. Let's talk about a progressive metal album. Let's talk about Savior Machine.
All right. The other thing that all those critics were taking their aggression out on, prog.
Yes, prog and Christianity. Savior Machine by Savior Machine. So I picked this one because it does represent a subgenre of music I like, which is the really pretentious metal. But I also, just on a more personal level, I wanted you to listen to it because on our old podcast, we had a episode that was very near and dear to my heart, which was about 80s Christian metal. And I threw this one on at the last possible second, even though it was released in, I think, 1990. And I don't think you or Don or old co-host got a chance to listen to it. And I was really depressed that you didn't. So I wanted to make sure that you heard it at some point in your life, even if you didn't end up liking it. So I threw it on there. But I do think, and I'll talk about it more because I want to get your thoughts first, but I do think this one is a very unique record that more people should listen to. But let me hear your thoughts first.
Under the caveat that I listen to this at work and the speakers are not good there. Yeah, I wanted to walk into it open-minded because there's a lot of qualifiers in this genre description that I'm not always huge on. Neoclassical, symphonic, goth metal is how you describe it to me. And those things don't always work that well together. But this time, I don't know what it was, but with the exception of the last song and its repetitive lyrics, I pretty much enjoyed the entirety of this album. The music is very evocative, genuinely touching in some parts, beautifully composed, and I appreciate that their vocalists stuck to just this very rich baritone, because anytime I see neoclassical or symphonic in a metal description, I expect it's gonna sound like somebody who's trying to sound like Rob Halford on cocaine, and I'm not about that.
Like you said, it's a very pleasing, steady baritone. He doesn't really reach beyond his grasp at any point. I think one of the reasons this album worked for you and one of the reasons it might work for other people is, even though I stick by my classification of calling it a neoclassical symphonic goth metal album, it kind of came out before any of those genres had sort of been ruined. Goth metal didn't really take off in full until probably like 97. Symphonic about the same time. Neoclassical, of course, you had the Shrapnel Records guys back then, but this is more neoclassical in the classical sense rather than playing Beethoven on a guitar.
In the non-neoclassical sense.
Right. So it definitely sounds more traditional classical. It's just neo by sake of not being from 300 years ago. I have a very big soft spot in my heart for old school Christian metal, just because I think it's a subgenre, if you really want to call it a subgenre, because there's Christian thrash, Christian death, Christian doom, a lot of Christian goth, actually. Talk more about that in a minute. On the whole, I think it's written off pretty much whole cloth. But then if you push people, they're like, well, Mortification's cool, or like Vengeance Rising. A lot of people like that's their in.
Vengeance Rising does rip.
They do. But I just think that there's a lot of stuff there. And as you probably remember from when we did that episode, a lot of these bands ate a lot of shit coming up. They had a really hard time finding an audience because not only did the secular metalheads not really want anything to do with them, even the churches, because they had this agenda to push against heavy metal, really didn't want them either. So they had to exist in these very small, insulated communities, like in Los Angeles. That's why you see so many of the same dudes showing up in the same bands. And there's like only 3 or 4 labels that would publish this shit. Savior Machine in particular, I don't know if you remember this or not from the old episode, but there's a story about them because they had a very theatrical stage show and they wore these white bucket head masks and robes and stuff.
I saw a sample of one of their sets on a YouTube link and thought, like, I should actually watch that. That looks cool.
Yeah, but I know in one instance, I think they were playing in Texas at like a church, and the venue operator or whatever was freaked out by it, shut down their sound. But it was kind of an inspiring story a little bit, just because they basically like walked off defeated to a McDonald's, and like everybody that was in the building followed them and just hung out with them after the half-completed show. It was a nice little story. But I definitely think if you're a really heavy thrash guy or death metal dude, this might not be your best intro. But if you're into like, solid cleans and just progressive metal, if you're a fan of Dream Theater or Fate's Warning or Crimson Glory, any of those early prog metal bands, I think you might like this one. And just other than the last song, which like you said is a little bit repetitive and overtly Christian, a lot of it is just revelations based. And there is some sort of ongoing story on this album. I haven't really looked at the lyrics enough to break it down or describe the concept, but there's definitely a lot of interesting ideas. It's not something that you're going to be like rolling your eyes at and thinking, oh brother. And I do think, like I said, I think a problem with a lot of Christian metal, and it's why so many bands tried to ride that goth wave, which I think was honestly a mistake because goth was pretty niche even when it's most popular. But a lot of these Christian bands trend hop, and it's because, if you're an evangelical Christian, part of your whole beliefs is like proselytizing. And of course, if you want to do that the most effectively, you have to play what the kids want to hear.
Even if it's black metal.
Right. Good old Horde. What do you want to talk about next?
All right. We'll do Night Flight Orchestra. Anybody who knows me knows this was going to pop up. One of my favorite bands these days. Night Flight Orchestra. We're talking about Internal Affairs. Their debut from 2012. Backstory of these guys, that's a bunch of Swedish death metal dudes who decided, hey, we like Stevie Nicks, why don't we just write some music of that sort? And they've been knocking out of the park on every album since, I personally think. And I guess probably more than most anybody else. This was one band I forced onto you, and I remember you actually liking them.
Yeah, I do like them a lot, although this was actually the first time I listened to this first album of theirs all the way through. And this is the only one from our 10 this week that I listened to twice. Night Flight Orchestra is a fascinating band for me. I know a lot of people group them in with like AOR Revival, which I don't think is entirely unfair. And I know this is something I've expressed to you before. I think the reason I find them interesting and the reason I like them is they're not a pitch-perfect revival of that peak 80s AOR, which a good example of that is one of my picks on a later episode, Giant, who we'll talk about. I'm very curious to get your thoughts on. But yeah, with Night Flight, it's weird because to me, they actually sound a little more like that very specific wave of AOR that occurred in the mid to late 70s. Your initial Sellout 38 special albums, stuff like Sheriff and Moxie, early Survivor, that whole wave, because it represents this period where hard rock hadn't completely shuffled away from its roots rock roots. God, say that 3 times fast. There's still tinges of southern rock, of blues, of just a little bit of country twang, and there's brief touches of that on this one, along with some disco. So that's why, to me, it honestly reminds me a little bit more of when people were still trying to figure it out. But even then, it's not completely perfect because you have this guy singing who is from the death metal school, and even though he's not doing death growls on this record, his voice is a little gruffer than you might expect from one of these guys. You had a lot of Geddy Lee types singing that kind of music, so it still sounds completely unique. I think on their later records, they kind of lean into the 80s a little bit more, but even then, they've carved this pretty unique niche for themselves that doesn't really fit in with that whole AOR revival that was really popping off overseas. It never really got that big in the States, but then again, neither did the 80s AOR, but it was big in Sweden, which might be where they got some of the inspiration from. But that stuff, I've heard a lot of it, and it's, oh yeah, that was good, but I never listened to it again. Night Flight Orchestra I go back to again and again. It was nice revisiting this one, or visiting this one for the first time, or revisiting the band. What else do you got on this one?
I would say this one specifically I did want to do because, agreeing with you, one of the best descriptions I ever heard of their sound is, more than anything else, they sound like a 70s band lasting into the 80s and adapting to the times. This album is definitely the one that's the most rooted in the 70s, I would say, of anything they've done. You get a certain pool of influences in this one I don't think you hear a lot, because later albums you'll hear a lot of Boston, Toto, later Survivor as well. This one you're getting tinges of the Eagles and Jackson Browne. There's a song in there that almost sounds like Steely Dan.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. There's one song later on that sounds very similar to a Bruce Springsteen song. One guitar lick that they do that reminds me of a Springsteen song, and I can't remember which song it is or which Springsteen song I'm thinking of, but that's there too.
Yeah, and that's something that I think is unique even in their discography. Talk about carving out a good niche. Even this album by itself sounds different than anything else they've done. And also, Speed, the vocalist, you can definitely tell he wasn't fully confident yet, because by the next album he was wailing constantly. Whereas this one, there is a much more level, even kind of tone to his voice, which I appreciate. It's cool to hear somebody finding their feet and then taking off on the next album and onwards.
Definitely. I don't know if I call it a concept album, but it's almost like a travelogue.
Their stated goal with forming Night Flight Orchestra was to create the perfect travel music.
Oh, there you go. But I think that also gives it that connection to like Heartland rock. Every song kind of has a little bit of a, what's that Bob Seger song that Metallica covered? Turn the Page, which I think adds just an additional level. But